Welcome to the session on Keynesian Equilibrium Analysis. In this session, I'll be covering the meaning of equilibrium and the two approaches of Keynesian Equilibrium Analysis, that is, consumption and investment approach, or C plus I approach, or ADAS approach, and savings and investment approach. There are two ways of understanding the meaning of equilibrium. In the first, we talk of equilibrium as the equality between two variables. In microeconomic theory, we talk of the equality between demand and supply. And in macroeconomic theory, we talk of the equality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In the second, we talk of of equilibrium as a state of rest, that is, a point from where there is no tendency to deviate. In economics, it implies that if there is any deviation from equilibrium, the economic variables will move or interact in such a way that the economy tends back to equilibrium. A classic example of this is the price mechanism, which is also called the theory of invisible hands, due to the automatic interaction of the forces of demand and supply to determine the equilibrium price. In case of any deviation, demand and supply forces act and react in such a way that the economy tends back to equilibrium. This is the familiar diagram of the price mechanism. Now, once the price is determined at the equilibrium point, and if there is any deviation, say for example, the price rises above the equilibrium price, then excess supply will bring it back to equilibrium. Similarly, if the market price falls below the equilibrium price, then excess demand will increase the price back to equilibrium. This is what we mean by equilibrium as state of rest in economics. Now let's move on to study the concept of equilibrium in Keynesian macroeconomic theory. There are two approaches to study the Keynesian equilibrium analysis. The first approach is called the consumption and investment approach, or C plus I approach, or AD and AS approach. The equilibrium condition for this approach is aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. The second approach is the savings and investment approach, or S&I approach, and the equilibrium condition for this approach is that savings is equal to investment. S is equal to I. Assuming a two-sector economy, that is, an economy in which there is a household sector and a firm's sector only. The equilibrium is attained at a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Now, aggregate demand is the sum of consumption demand and investment demand. That is, AD is equal to C plus I. And aggregate supply is nothing else but national income and is the sum of consumption and savings. That is, AS is equal to C plus S. And the equality between AD and AS automatically implies the equality between investment and savings. So both the approaches reach the same conclusion. An important point to note here is that since aggregate supply is the same thing as national income, therefore the equilibrium condition can be written as Y is equal to C plus I, where Y is aggregate supply and C plus I is aggregate demand. Let's understand the consumption and investment approach with the help of a diagram. Let's draw the axes and label them. Income on the x-axis and aggregate demand on the y-axis. The 45-degree line represents the AS curve and the C plus I curve represents the AD curve. Wherever the two curves intersect, that's the equilibrium point E, and Y star is the equilibrium level of output. Now, the condition of equilibrium can also be expressed as planned spending is equal to planned output. We have assumed a two-sector economy with households on one end and firms on the other. Now, households and firms are two totally different sets of people with different objectives. The main objective of the households is to maximize their satisfaction levels, and the main objective of the firms is to maximize their profits. Therefore, according to Keynes, equilibrium is that special point where what households plan to spend is exactly equal to what firms plan to produce. So, equilibrium becomes a very special point. Now, once equilibrium is achieved, there will be less tendency to deviate from that point. But in case there are any deviations, the economy will tend back to equilibrium. Let's understand how that happens. For that, let's take an output level less than the equilibrium output, say Y1. At Y1, we see that the C plus I curve lies above the 45-degree line. That is, AD is greater than AS. Now, when AD is greater than AS, it implies that planned spending of the households is greater than planned output of the firms. This will lead to an unplanned decrease in inventories of the firms because the producers now will take out goods from their inventories and sell them in the market to meet the high demand. The decrease in inventories acts as a signal for the firms or the producers to increase their output levels. And when output or production increases, income and employment levels also increase. So there is an increase in output, income, and employment levels from Y1 towards Y star till equilibrium is restored. Now let's take an output and income level greater than the equilibrium output, say Y2. At Y2, the C plus I curve lies below the 45-degree line. That is, aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. Or, in other words, planned spending is less than planned output. Now, since planned spending is less, people are not spending more. There will be an unplanned increase in inventories of unsold goods with the producers. And now this acts as a signal for the producers to decrease their production levels. Therefore, there will be a decrease in output, income, and employment levels from Y2 to Y star till equilibrium is restored again. Let's understand the savings and investment approach with the help of a diagram. Let's draw the axes and label them. Income on the x-axis, savings and investment on the y-axis. Next, we draw an upward sloping savings curve starting from the negative quadrant and label it as S. Keynes assumed investment to be autonomous, that is, independent of the level of income. In other words, investment remains constant at all levels of income. So the investment curve is drawn as a horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis and is labeled as I. Since the equilibrium condition is savings is equal to investment, wherever the two curves intersect, that is the equilibrium point E, and Y star is the equilibrium level of income and output. Now, the equilibrium condition can more specifically be stated as planned savings is equal to planned investment. Once equilibrium is achieved, the economy will not generally deviate from the equilibrium level. But in case there are deviations, the economy tends back to the equilibrium level. Let's understand how this happens. For that, let's take an income and output level less than the equilibrium level, say Y1. At Y1, savings curve lies below the investment curve. That means planned savings is less than planned output. So if the households are saving less, it implies that they are demanding more. Therefore, it is a similar situation of aggregate demand being greater than aggregate supply. Thus, when planned savings is less than planned investments, then it leads to an unplanned decrease in inventories, which acts as a signal for the producers to increase their production level, and thus it leads to an increase in output, income, and employment from Y1 to Y star till equilibrium is restored. Let's now take an output and income level greater than the equilibrium level, say Y2. At Y2, savings curve lies above the investment curve. This implies that planned savings is greater than planned investment. That means people are saving more and therefore spending less. And it is a situation similar to aggregate demand being less than aggregate supply. Now, so households are consuming less and saving more. This leads to an unplanned increase in inventories for the producers, and it acts as a signal for the producers to decrease their production levels. Therefore, there is a decrease in output, income, and employment levels from Y2 to Y star till equilibrium is restored again. If you have any doubts, please leave them in the comment section below. In case you found the video helpful, remember to press the like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel for more economics concepts and tutorials.